If you're a fan of steampunk, then maybe you've seen steam-powered cars. Most likely you have. Although historically they were largely beaten out by the railroad until gasoline-powered cars. APPARE RANMAN, an anime about a transcontinental American race which pits new gasoline cars against the railroad in a grand competition. In the anime, the two main characters, APPARE and Cosima, find themselves in America after being stranded in the middle of the ocean in APPARE's homemade steamboat and being rescued by a ship on course to America. The two decide to enter the race in order to win the prize money, with the initial goal of being using said money to pay for passage back to Japan. During such a race, they and the other racers find themselves being opposed by bandits hired by a railroad tycoon intent on sabotaging the race. My question today, which I'll explore, is was there really any competition between the railroad and the automobile industries as shown in the anime? In other words, did the railroad make any attempts to stop the development of the automobile? And if they did, why they did it, and why they lost in the end, and why they didn't lose? Before that, though, I'm Anime Lore, and I make videos on anime, history, and things related. Stay tuned, as I'll also be mentioning some real car races which might have helped inspire the anime. Somewhat surprisingly, the idea of the automobile long predated the railroad. Leonardo da Vinci considered the idea, and several others over time experimented with various methods of making a self-propelled vehicle. One idea I found was powered by air, although the first true automobile wouldn't be possible until the use of steam, with the first one being made by Nicolas Joseph Cognat of France in 1769, which, while slow at only about 2 miles per hour, still moved. Steam carriages began to take off, though, by the 1830s in England, and though they were reliable and fast enough, topping supposedly at 17 miles per hour, to become commercially viable for a time, they were extremely loud and obstructed roads, among many other problems. Despite all the issues, though, a single route in half a year in 1831 had some 3,000 passengers. But they would begin to add up as public animosity against them grew. This wasn't helped by animosity from the traditional horse carriage services, which resulted in far higher toll gate fees for steam cars than horse-drawn carriages. At the same time, the railroad developed experimental lines in the 1820s and 1830s, which over time grew into a much more comfortable method of travel for passengers compared to the smog-ridden, bumpy steam cars, as passengers were separated from the actual steam locomotive, which, amazingly, was useful. More importantly, the railroad had far greater cargo capacity, which means it was able to put in much more money due to cargo being more profitable than passengers, and more investors being willing to invest in cargo transport than passenger transport. Due to the railroad's rapid rise, however, routes were overbuilt, especially in America, which wasn't helped by frequent government funding. This can be best seen with the U.S. government's funding of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was famously corrupt as the railroad companies were paid per mile in land and money, and as such, the rail line would be extended longer than needed to gain more government funding and land. As such, the railroad likely had enough steam behind it that the steam car lacked a future. However, this was made even more so in England by the Locomotives on Highways Act of 1865. The act limited the top speed of steam automobiles to a measly 2 miles per hour within cities and double that in rural areas. This alone killed any chance for them to gain popularity with the general public. Although with the additional requirement of a crew member to walk in front waving a red flag as a warning, it's understandable such vehicles really had no future. Whether the railroad played a part, to my understanding, is only speculation, but it's safe to say that they did somewhat benefit, although they weren't much of a competition, to be fair. But a more simple explanation is likely better, with the laws being made due to the increasing public dislike of the steam-powered cars, as I mentioned earlier. The act would be amended in 1878 and repealed fully by 1896, just in time for the rise of gasoline-powered cars. In the meantime, though, the railroad only continued to grow, as governments became more invested in them than ever, as they proved essential for the Union and Prussian victories in the American Civil War and Franco-Prussian Wars, respectively. Developments of the car continued, though, and experiments were made into gasoline cars in Europe. However, the first successful gasoline car was made by Karl Benz in 1885 in Germany. Many companies in the years to follow, both in Europe and America, experimented with various designs, with tens of thousands of cars being sold. Although even by 1903, many were split between steam-powered, gasoline-powered, and even electric-powered, which had been considered, although the lack of infrastructure and limited chargeability ended electric cars until modern day. Steam's ongoing problems also couldn't be solved, and as improvements were made with gasoline, that too would replace, though far earlier than electric. While the anime portrayed the race as being to increase the popularity of the car, enthusiasts had been organizing races historically since the Paris Run race in 1894. Dozens of races occurred across Europe and America, which were able to show the public the abilities of the new machines and excite the public imaginations of the possibilities of the historical dislike of them. The most similar race to the anime I could find was a race held in 1909, which went from New York City to Seattle, Washington. The winner being a Model T Ford, which was disqualified though for modifying the vehicle, which would disqualify APPARE several times over the anime. All these races likely helped improve public opinion, and if anything, would have brought more money into the industry, which will help the car's revival after dying as an idea in the 1840s to the railroad. The automobile industry really took off, of course, with Henry Ford and his Model T. In 1908, along with lessons taken from French racing steel and his previous designs, Henry Ford was able to design a cheap and reliable car which could become commonly used by the public instead of luxury and a sports item, which had been previously the use of cars. Ford would employ the railroad to support his efforts. The railroad would bring supplies and equipment for his factories, although this often proved difficult due to heavy government regulation. Government overreach was made especially worse as Ford was sued by the owner of the American automobile patent, who had never actually made an automobile. Post-World War I, an ever-increasing economy would allow the car to boom from the common man in Europe and America, in addition to increased competition for Ford. This, of course, slowed down with the Great Depression and World War II. But in the post-war, the U.S. government once again got involved, which finally tipped things more towards the car over the railroad. The U.S. government's large-scale highway building in the 1950s allowed the car to finally compete with the railroad, where the railroad historically dominated cargo. Though the large semi-trucks, cargo was able to be transported much more efficiently by cutting out unnecessary stops at railroad terminals. Although the railroad does remain important today, at least in the U.S., passenger trains are fairly rare. High-speed rail is increasing in countries like Japan and China, and is likely to develop in America and Europe in the coming decades, which, who knows, may tip things back in the railroad's favor. The conclusion of this is, surprisingly overall, the railroad actually benefited from the rise of the car. The car allowed many railroads to offload their less profitable businesses, which were passenger trains and small cargo, which isn't efficient for rail transport. However, all this allowed the railroad to focus on what it does best, and that is the transportation of heavy cargo, which ironically includes cars themselves. The car, too, also benefited, as mentioned earlier. The railroad allowed for more extensive supply lines, which allowed for dozens of companies to make what at the time, and still is today, complicated machinery. So overall, the railroad, as portrayed by APPARE RANMAN, is incredibly short-sighted, and would risk being exposed for their involvement in several murders and corporate espionage to prevent the rise of an automobile industry which overall benefits them. If you found any of this interesting, I would encourage you to check out the anime, even if at times it can be a bit ridiculous with a steam slash gasoline slash jet powered car by the end, because that's how things work. And if you like the video, I've been Anime Law, and would be grateful if you left a like, subscribe to the channel, and maybe left a comment.